Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
There's this painting my wife loves called Death and Life by Clement. I don't know what she finds so fascinating about it. I made all the right noises when she showed me her beloved framed print when we were first dating, oohing and ahhing and making up some bullshit about warm and cold color schemes and the specific choice of angles and line. She was an artist herself. Our first few dates involved long walks through museums, starting in Picasso's Blue Period and ending in heavy petting and blue balls. I took an art history course as an elective when I was finishing up my doctorate. I remembered enough of the lingo to charm my fantastically gorgeous future wife and lure her back to my stupidly filthy apartment. We're talking me as the foul bachelor frog, sitting on a lily pad made of empty takeout containers, surrounded by a pond of enough unwashed clothes to keep a laundromat in business for a cool 6 months. I remember scrambling to find 2 of any sort of cup-like containers for the bottle of wine we had brought back while she was in the bathroom. I rinsed out a couple of coffee mugs and ran into the bedroom to try to clean up the condom wrappers that had been sitting on my bedside table since 2003. On the bed, neatly laid out against the rest of the chaos, were my wife's dress, bra, and panties. She came out of the bathroom completely nude, aside from a pair of high heels, took the wine from me, and took a swig straight from the bottle. I fell totally, completely, and irrevocably in love. I have no head for artistic things. I work in finance. I get creative with numbers, not paint. But I fucking love her stuff. She's made a name for herself over the past few years. Critics call her the American Damien Hirst. One of her first exhibits was composed of a dozen oil paintings of rotting pastries, surrounding an actual cake filled with thousands of dead ladybugs being fed to a mummified tarantula dressed up as, well, Little Miss Muffet. I have no idea what it meant, but it was sick, successful, and catered by Balthazar, so I ate about 20 croissants. They didn't have any bugs in them. I checked. She was amazing. She had the body of a Laker girl and the face of a Modigliani model, and still does. She's charming, charismatic, deep. The kind of person people flock to, want to be around constantly. She fucked like she had something to prove, and she had a twisted sense of humor. As soon as I hooked a job with enough figures to keep a girl like her satisfied the way she should be, I proposed. Bought her a historical brownstone in the city with a garden full of roses and hardwood mahogany floors. And for the first few years, she seemed happy. We were the kind of couple you see in New York Magazine and scoff at because they're just too damned lucky. But we had a rough spot, like all married couples do. She was still superficially the same woman I fell in love with. Looked amazing. People always asked me when she was going to host the next dinner party. She still had an amazing eye for art. I knew, though. I knew that she was miserable. I could see it. The misery in the corners of her eyes and the curve of her mouth. It happened gradually. First it was the shower curtain. She bought 3 or 4 from a small boutique downtown, brought them home so we could choose one out together. We decided on one, pale blue, made of the material that was impractical and way too expensive for a drapery in a bathroom, but we had the money and it made her happy, so why the hell not? A few days later, I was shaving and realized that she still hadn't put the curtain up. It wasn't until about a month after that I caught a glimpse of it hanging up in her studio. Cut to shreds and dyed till it was almost unrecognizable. I chose to ignore it because I had learned it's usually not the best course of action to call an artist out on their creative license, unless you want to start an all-out war with no discernible end. A year after that, though, I had no choice. She had been so on edge, it was like she was standing on a razor. She usually had a show every 3-4 months or so, and if anything, she had too many ideas. The galleries always asked her to trim down her collections. When the year passed without so much as a single finished painting, I started to worry, both about her well-being and our bank account. We were extravagant spenders, and each of her shows would bring in a cool 20 grand that paid for a few months of European beaches and ski trips in Aspen. The final straw, though, is when she burned down the roses. It turned out she had finished dozens of projects over the year. She had hated all of it and had either destroyed or painted over everything. While I was at the office, she flew off the handle, doused about 16 canvases in lighter fluid, and set the yard on fire. When I got the call from the fire department, I rushed home to find her sitting in the back of the ambulance, covered in ashes, blonde hair singed at the ends. She was smoking a cigarette. I looked over the burnt flowers, the skeletons of her paintings, the ruined limbs of broken sculptures, and asked her what had happened and why. She took a drag at the cigarette and said, "It was mine to burn." She took big fancy pictures of the inferno. A family of bunnies suffocated in the smoke. She had them stuffed and mounted in size order on a baking soda volcano like the kind you see in middle school science fairs. She gathered up a few of the charred bits and pieces, wired it together and made some warped, pained-looking kind of phoenix thing, weighing in at 400 pounds and easily over 8 feet high. She called the whole thing From the Ashes, and the reviews in the Times called it, incendiary. Her first foray into becoming a true artist. Someone bought the phoenix. I pity the person who wakes up every day and looks at that strange thing, suspended in constant agony. We were both drunk at a random, expensive, vaguely Dante's Inferno-themed bar in San Francisco when I finally got a chance to ask her what was bothering her. We had been making dark jokes all night about the beautiful irony of her show and our current locale. At first, she vehemently denied anything was wrong, angrily pointing out that we had made 4 times as much off her last show as anything before it, that it had more than covered the damages, that it had paid for the vacation we were on. I stayed silent. She tossed her newly cropped hair and looked like she was going to open up for a second. I saw her soft blue eyes fill with tears. Then she took a shot of whiskey from a glass that had a bull's head and smirked. "Well, for starters," she slurred, nonchalantly dangling the glass from the bull's nose ring, "I'm fairly certain I'm pregnant." She let the glass drop from her finger and it shattered on the floor as she slid out of her seat and stumbled to the exit. I sat there for a while and drank more, feeling furious, confused, and miserable. I remembered her face when she showed me that Clement painting. I remembered how she wore glasses back then, how she pushed them up to the bridge of her nose when she smiled as I talked about the fucking warm and the fucking cold colors, and the fucking angles and fucking lines. We converted her studio into a nursery. Rather, I did, while she stayed in San Francisco and did God knows what with her artist friends. I had a landscaper come in and replant the roses. I worked a lot of overtime, drank myself to sleep while I skimmed through parenting books. She came back when she was almost full term. I came home from work one night to find sonogram pictures pasted all over the fridge of 2 healthy-looking twins, big baby girls. I walked into our bedroom and saw her dead asleep on top of the covers, belly swollen, smelling faintly like pot and paint thinner. She had a rainbow of dried paint on her fingertips. I loosened my tie and walked to the nursery. She had been busy. The canary yellow I had chosen was covered in a layer of translucent blue, and she had covered one of the walls in Clement-esque patterns and curlicues. The creamy plush carpet was covered in paint splatters. She had worked furiously to finish. She had cut a swath from one of the new rose bushes and made a giant bouquet, shoving them so tightly in the vase that some had escaped and made their way from their perch on the changing table to the floor. She had scattered them in the bassinet, on the windowsill. It was chaotic and utterly breathtaking. The next few years were peaceful, for the most part. We bonded over raising the girls. Despite my wife's less than careful prenatal preparation, they were both wickedly smart and beautiful. They both looked like her, with long, curly blonde ringlets and blue eyes. Sometimes when I put them to bed, I wondered if any of my DNA was in them at all. They were like miniature versions of her. My wife agreed to see a psychiatrist for a little bit. She took some medication for a while, Xanax, some mood stabilizers. Eventually, she and her doctor decided her crisis had been hormonal and temporary. We started having dinner parties again, soothed the gossip that had infected our social circles. She stopped painting and took up teaching at a university. She seemed content again, even happier than she was before. Every once in a while, I would catch a look in her eyes like repressed artillery fire, like she was ready to explode at any second. But it never lasted for longer than a few seconds before they went back to the soft cornflower blue I knew so well. And who doesn't get a little agitated every once in a while? I rose through the ranks at work. I loved the feeling of power that came with promotions. I loved my girls. And by God, I loved her. My crazy, disgusting, beautiful, hateful, and loving, extraordinary wife. Then came today. Today, I came home from work early. Today, my wife took the day off to be a chaperone on a class trip to the Met. They were after her for months because of her expertise in the art world. They wanted the children to experience the culture in the most sophisticated way possible. I thought it was ridiculous. They were 1 to 3 years old in a private daycare. They saw more beauty in Cheerios than in Monet's water lilies. But they wore my wife down, and she was given a gaggle of toddlers and wide-eyed teachers to tour around the museum. I came home from lunch because I had forgotten my iPad that had notes on it for a presentation I was giving that night. I walked through the rose garden and noticed a tiny piece of sculpture left over from the Ashes exhibit from so long ago. It was half of a tiny bird. It had the kind of exquisite detail that my wife used to be so famous for. I was pretty sure it was an actual bird that she had cast in clay. I thought I could see a small piece of feather in one of the cracks. I idly wondered why I hadn't noticed it before. I went inside and poured myself a glass of orange juice. The fridge had pictures that my daughters drew. Happy, crooked stick figures that looked nothing like the beautiful horrors their mother used to churn out. I was happy about that. I hoped they would fall in love with numbers like I did. It was absolutely silent, and I sipped the sweet citrus and enjoyed the nothingness. Then, I thought I caught a vague sense of fresh paint in the air. Curious, I walked into the living room, and there was my wife, sitting on the leather couch with a bottle of wine, looking like an angel of death. She was covered head to toe in blue-gray body paint, with a special concentration underneath her eyes. She was wearing a revealing patchwork blue dress, covered in crosses of various shapes and sizes. Not a dress, I realized, but the shredded shower curtain from so many years ago. I could see most of her still perfect breasts, the curve of her waist. The bottle of wine was elongated and painted a strange shade of orange. The smell of the paint was stronger in here, an overwhelming smell of lighter fluid, and something else I couldn't place. She had shaven her head. I stared at her for a while. Minutes? An hour, maybe? Eventually, she took a swig of wine from the bottle, swirling it around in her mouth. I noticed paint, deep blues and even deeper reds around her fingers. I sat down in the armchair across from her, unable to think of what exactly I wanted to ask her. Maybe because I knew. Maybe because I didn't want to know. I noticed a camera on the table between us. I went to pick it up and she rested her gray hand on mine before I could, softly, gently, with all the familiarity of years of marriage. She opened her mouth to speak, soft pink lips made pallid by the paint. They were mine. And I've been sitting here, knowing what's behind the door to my daughter's room with the klimt wall we never repainted. Knowing why my phone keeps ringing with calls from the school, from the NYPD. Knowing why I couldn't find my sleeping pills last night. Knowing what that smell is. Seeing in my peripheral the red pooling and staining the carpet from underneath the door, the pile of clothes neatly folded next to my wife on the couch. I can picture that thick wire she used to fit all of her subjects where she wanted them. What a perfect, detailed recreation it must be. Because she's so perfect. I see the phoenix in my mind's eye. I hope when she flicks that cigarette she's about to light, that we both fucking burn.
My aunt was a con artist, and she learned from the best, her father. Grandpa never made it big, but he lived for the game. Staying under the radar was probably what made sure he never did get caught. Not once. He was so proud of that. Mom didn't take up the family business. She got religion instead and married a tax accountant. It's so ironic that it sounds like a joke, but it's true. My dad was the best for helping out with math homework. Mom's more colorful relations were kept at a figurative arm's length throughout my childhood, lest they corrupt me into following a more interesting life path. Aunt Cassie was the only one who could wiggle her way into my life. She was fully licensed as a psychologist, which made her a smidge more respectable. But Aunt Cassie used her ability to read a person in a whole different way, one probably not intended by the university that issued her degree. Aunt Cassie was a bona fide psychic. She had a shop and everything: crystals, herbs, candles. Anything you needed to fill the mystic void in your life could be bought for a healthy markup at her little store. There was even a private room in the back that was used for readings and seances. Because both my folks worked, I would often get dropped off at the shop where I would help Aunt Cassie out with those little shows. Anything from messing with the lights to knocking on walls. Playing with the thermostat was my idea, and it was an effective one. Customers came to get chills down their spine, didn't they? Why not provide? Cassie helped me become the skeptic I am today, showed me all the behind-the-scenes sleight-of-hand stuff. We'd watch daytime talk shows with magicians and mediums, and Cassie would explain every step from a basic rundown of cold readings to how to spot an audience plant. After one particularly convincing episode, I asked the natural question, couldn't some of it be real? My aunt's reply was firm. The dead don't talk, kiddo. Anyone who claims otherwise is blowing smoke. It was her conviction more than anything that made me believe her. There was only one client I ever saw my aunt refuse. He was old, bald, and stooped. Took his hat off when he came inside and twisted it in his hands as he talked. Cassie tensed up immediately when she saw him. The man claimed to have worked in the prison systems, death row. He'd been responsible for carrying out the final punishments of the worst convicted criminals on the planet. In his old age, this tormented him and ate at his soul. He wanted Cassie to contact the souls of the ones he'd killed so he could apologize and beg forgiveness before he joined them. My aunt threw the most epic fit. I'd never seen her so mad. She hollered and threw things. "Get out!" she shouted. "Out, out, out, out! Shut up! Get out!" I hid under the counter with my hands over my ears until he left. Later, I thought her reaction was one of fear because of the man's job. An executioner has to be a con artist's worst fear. Eventually, I got found out. I put on a magic show for my folks, and because my mom missed my grandpa so much, I did a medium bit where I pretended to talk to him. Huge mistake. How stupid of me. My mother wasn't amused. Instead, she freaked out and banned me from seeing her sister ever again. I'd left some textbooks at the shop, though, so I was allowed to run in and grab them while Mom fumed in the car outside. Aunt Cassie didn't even have to ask what was wrong. She could read my face, after all. I gave her a hug and a teary, snot-filled goodbye. She did tell me one last secret, though. Kiddo, there's a curse in this family that gets passed like a torch. I hope to whatever gods might be out there that I don't pass it on to you when I go. We didn't get to talk again for more than 9 years. By that time, no parental ban could keep me from trying to reconnect. Still, it was awkward. Aunt Cassie had a tough go of life, diagnosed with a schizoid disorder that took her business from her. To pay bills, she'd gone legitimate, and with her business went all her zest and playful passion for life. One day I returned home and found a message waiting in my inbox that made my stomach drop to the floor. I love you, kiddo. Remember what I told you. I dialed her number, already crying. No answer. I dialed again and again. I was too much of a mess to tell my mom. The police did that for me the next day. Car accident. Drunk driver. The funeral was a blur. Relatives I'd never seen in the flesh packed the church. I sat between my parents in the front row and racked my brain trying to figure out what it was my aunt wanted me to remember. We followed the hearse to the cemetery in dead silence. When the priest finished speaking, everyone took their leave. I stood a while, staring at the headstone, straining to recall something, anything about my aunt's last request. I drew blanks. If only Cassie hadn't been so cryptic. That's when I overheard someone say, "We weren't expecting such a small turnout. It's a shame." Small turnout? That bothered me. The service had in fact been well attended. The church had practically been stuffed to the rafters. I turned around to say something and finally understood. Behind my parents stood a whole host of people, all standing and staring dead ahead. My parents weren't paying them the slightest attention. The priest muttered his condolences and excused himself, walking right through the thick of the crowd without disturbing a single soul. At the head of the group, looking just as she did the day I'd seen her last, was Cassie. All of the rest in peace sentiment in the world wouldn't have done her any good. Her mouth was wide, wide open, and just like that, I knew. I know now what the family curse is. I know why the dead don't talk. They're too busy screaming.
It's been 20 years since I worked as a counselor at Camp Valleyway. 20 years that I've tried to forget what I saw, lying to myself and others about what I know happened. And for many of those years, I succeeded in fooling myself, pushing the dark thoughts to a hidden place in my mind. But after reading the newspaper today, I can lie no longer. Let me begin my story. I started work when I was 15, spending my summers away at Camp Valleyway. The camp was nestled in the foothills of the Appalachians, cupped in a valley between two mountains with a natural lake at the center, its waters stained murky with southern clay. I worked as a swim instructor, and each week, a new set of campers traveled from across the state to experience the outdoors. I still remember the exact day it happened. Tuesday, 5th week of camp, the hottest day of that summer, and just before the 4th of July. That week was known as Rich Week to the counselors, since many of the wealthier parents took off for the holiday and left their children behind. It came right after the Orphan Week, which was when the Clarkstown Orphanage, largest in the state, traveled to camp free of charge because the camp was government-owned. Yearly, the local residents came by at the end of the week, and children were often adopted. Just last week, a girl in my class had found a new home with some farmers a few miles out, and I remember seeing Ellie wave from the cab of a pickup truck as she started her new life in the country. As a swim instructor, in my off time, I helped the sail instructors patch sails under the water sports canopy. Logan, the head of water sports, and about 5 years older than me, sat across one of the picnic tables, his small eyes looking over the lake. Logan kept his hair in a tight buzz cut, revealing a scar around the back of his head, and when he spoke, it was in a deep drawl. "Mike, watch what you're doing," he growled, noticing I had skipped a stitch. "I only got 2 eyes and there's too much going on for me to watch everyone today." "Got it," I said, and put my head down. Logan kept a tight watch on his crew, but now his focus was on the lake. Ed and Ted, 2 twin counselors with one brain between them, were teaching a beginner's swimming course. Ed and Ted always made Logan uneasy, and had earned a spot of first and second on his mental list of instructors who were most likely to screw up next. So when Ed, the smarter of the two, came sprinting up from the lakeside so fast his long legs spewed a dirt exhaust behind him, Logan was ready. Ed opened his mouth, words wheezing in between each intake breath, and his wet hair plastered over one eye. "We're missing one camper. Can't find him in the water. Friends, don't know where he is." Without hesitation, Logan's whistle shrieked through the campground, startling campers and counselors alike. "Out of the water! Out of the water! All lifeguards to the dock!" he shouted, his deep chest working like a bellow as adrenaline shot through me and we ran to the water. As a lifeguard, it was our responsibility to search for the body, and 15 of us lined up in one end of the swimming section. At Logan's call, we dove, myself in the deeper end at 14 feet, and spread out across the bottom. The water filtered sunlight and heat, so the bottom was cold and dark, with underwater plants that gripped against my calves and pulled me back as I swam. After 3 strokes, I returned to the surface, and Logan sent us back down again to search, hoping to find a still warm form. I was the one who found the body. Its hand brushed against my face, a pale palm that was all too white. I saw the face next, too dark to recognize, but a girl, with long hair that fanned around her like she was under static electricity. I gasped, involuntarily drawing in water to my lungs, gripped her torso, and began swimming to the surface. She felt swollen, her arms too big, and her temperature a cold I will never forget. Halfway to the surface, I felt her leg catch on something, and she was pulled back down out of my grip. I turned, watching her open eyes on mine as she descended, but my lungs screamed, and I knew I needed air or I would join her down below for much longer than intended. "I found her!" I shouted, breaking the surface. "Quick!" And I dove back down, my hands sweeping through the muddy bottom. But I found nothing but muck and empty water, even as the other lifeguards joined. 5 minutes later, and Logan's whistle rang out again, calling us to the dock. "The camper has been found," he announced, "in a restroom by his site. Ed and Ted must have let him slip past them, and both of them will spend this night scrubbing the dock with your own toothbrushes." He paused, and I felt the other lifeguard's gaze fall on me. "You're all free to go, except for Mike. I want a word." The others trudged away, looking back at us over their shoulder. Logan focused on me, spittle meshing with his words as he hissed. "I don't know what the hell that was about, Mike, but you could have cost us a life with your false call back there. And next time you try something like this, I'll take yours." "But I saw something," I insisted. "I don't believe in ghosts, Mike, and we scoured that water." "Get out of my sight. You're off waterfront." He left, and word spread around the camp about what had happened. I could tell many of them detested me, and none believed what had happened. So I quit the next week, and pushed the thought from my mind, though it still found my dreams. That was 20 years ago. And today I hold the newspaper, the top article calling back my memories. Murders at Camp Valleyway. 19 skeletons have been discovered in the lake of Camp Valleyway, several aged over 30 years since time of death and none younger than 10. Due to renovations, the lake was drained, revealing a collection of bones at the deepest region. Several femurs were found attached to anchors with rope, and after much investigation, the state police discovered the source of the bodies. 10 years ago, before Clarkstown Orphanage was shut down for embezzling state funds, each summer their orphans spent a week at the camp. 19 were thought to be adopted by locals in nearby proximity to the camp, but after reviewing records, police have discovered these adoptions were never documented. All 19 were drowned and disposed of in the lake at an area too deep for the campers to normally enter, except for one that drifted near the swimming area due to an insecure rope. It is believed that the orphanage collected funds appropriated for these children long after their death. Police encourage anyone with information on the matter to step forward.
In 2 miles, take exit 19 for Valley Park Drive South. Siri chirped from my sister's phone. Charlotte, turn that off. I know where I'm going. You sure about that? I mean, it has been a couple of decades, Mark. Please. Like I could ever forget where Adventure Valley is. Come on, we spend every summer of... There it is! I swerved briefly into the oncoming lane as Charlotte thrust her arm in front of my face to point excitedly out the window. There's Adventure Valley! Oh my god, what ride is that? That coaster. It was called Steel something, right? No, wait, that's Mayhem Mountain, isn't it? I gently pushed my sister's arm out of my face and back over to her seat. I couldn't fault her for her excitement, being that it was taking an awful lot of effort to control my own giddiness. It felt like we were kids again, yelling and bouncing in the back seat of my parents' car as the first shining rails and wooden planks of the park's roller coasters came into view above the treetops. That's the Steel Viper, I told her. Mayhem Mountain's on the other end of the park, and that wooden roller coaster over there is the Excalibur. Oh yeah, I remember those. I was always too much of a wuss to ride the Viper, but I rode the crap out of the Excalibur. Well, Charlotte, you're an adult now. I think it's time to take on the Viper. As long as the contractors have tested it and given it the okay, I'm in. That was really the question, wasn't it? We didn't know which rides had been inspected and cleared and which ones hadn't. I sent up a silent prayer that Mayhem Mountain was counted among the rides that had. I'd left Brandon several voicemails asking about it since he was the one in charge of everything. But with how fast things had been moving since we'd bought the park, I couldn't fault him for being a busy man. If you'd told 12-year-old me that my crazy, hyper, wild-eyed friend Brandon Decker would end up graduating cum laude from Northwestern Business School, I would have laughed in your face. Brandon? No way. Tyler, maybe, but never Brandon. In fact, half the reason I think he chose a business designation was because of Adventure Valley. When the park had closed in 1989, Brandon had gathered us all together in his basement, and with a gravitas and solemnity I've never seen in him before or since, asked us to make the pact. At the time, the promise had been the most serious vow that 5 12-year-olds could ever make. High off an entire summer of Adventure Valley fun, we agreed, with all the ceremony of a meeting of Parliament, that we would one day come together and buy Adventure Valley Amusement Park. Of course, back then, our plan had been to buy it and just ride the roller coasters into the ground. We decided which friends from school we would let in and which enemies would be barred from the gates. It had always been our park, and it was only right that we should have it. It had taken 20 years, but we eventually did fulfill our promise. With a hell of a lot of pushing from Brandon, and a sizable offer of collateral from Tyler, the bank had agreed to give us a multi-million-dollar loan to buy, repair, refurbish, and reopen the park. The size of the loan for which the 6 of us were now responsible had given me nightmares for several weeks. How would this place ever turn a profit? It had been closed decades ago after operating in the red for several years. The county had experienced a high number of runaways and missing persons in the area in the last years of the 1980s. The entire region had been on edge as the cases mounted and people in the area became depressed and suspicious of each other. It had absolutely killed park attendance. But seeing the first cresting waves of roller coaster rails through the trees made me all but forget about my financial worries. This was Adventure Valley, for God's sake. If we opened the gates, people would come. There! That's our exit! Charlotte squeaked. I pulled off the interstate and took a left under the bridge. Less than a mile later, we came upon the park's acres of parking lots to our right. We turned in and drove all the way up to the front near the gates where several other cars were parked. A Lexus, a Mini Cooper, an old Chevelle, and a Honda Civic, another rental car like ours. "Looks like we're the last ones here," Charlotte said. She was right. As we pulled up next to the Lexus, I noticed a group of people standing next to the ticket booth, waving to us excitedly. "Oh my god, is that Tyler? Wow, he's lost some weight. He's so skinny now. And Brandon's losing his hair. Whoa, is that Koji? Koji got hot." Calm down, Paris Hilton. These guys are my friends. They're off limits to you, same rules as when we were teenagers. Besides, half of them are married. Really? Which half? I raised an eyebrow at Charlotte and shook my head in amused bewilderment. My little sister never had outgrown her boy craziness. "Wait, who's that?" Charlotte asked as we got out of the car. "What? That's Scott. You know Scott." "Not Scott. Scott looks exactly the same. The girl next to Scott." "Oh." I'd put this off so long that I'd actually forgotten to tell my sister at all. "That's Danny, Scott's girlfriend." "Danny? As in Danielle Bircher?" "Well, yeah." My sister gave me such a horrified look that you'd think I'd betrayed her to the death. But it was fleeting and quickly replaced by a sly smile. "Fine by me. I'm sure she's not the same person she was in high school. We're all adults now, right? Now come on, let's go." A sigh of relief escaped my chest as I slammed the car door and followed Charlotte over to the entrance. Though I saw most of these guys every year, seeing us all here together, standing at the ticket booths of Adventure Valley, brought me a sort of happiness I hadn't experienced in many years. Mark Lantis, I can't believe it. Tyler had an edgy, commanding voice that probably made his many employees shudder and scatter, but I knew him like a brother, so his bravado just made me laugh. "Can you believe it?" I asked as I gave him a hug and a slap on the back. "Back at the front gates. $15 a day doesn't seem so ridiculous now." "Pfft, $15 a day, my ass," Brandon said as he shook my hand. "By my math, it looks like we'll be charging about $65 a day." "I'll pay it," Charlotte smiled as she gave Koji a hug. "Are people really going to pay $65 a day?" Koji asked. "Even Disneyland only charges $85, and there you get access to 2 parks. "How could I forget?" Brandon shook his head. "One of our investors works for the mouse. Pity they won't let you design any artwork for this place." "Come on, man, I'm not an artist. I'm an engineer." "Don't you mean Imagineer?" Charlotte winked at him. Koji sighed and shook his head. "Yeah, I do." As Brandon and Charlotte teased Koji, I made my way over to the side of the ticket booth where Scott and his girlfriend were conversing. I didn't know why Scott was being so standoffish, but I thought it might have something to do with the investment. Scott, the least well-off of the 6 of us, worked at his dad's collision shop and hadn't had a whole lot of money to invest. I thought maybe he was embarrassed about the money, but now, watching him lean against the booth with slowly shifting eyes, I realized it wasn't that at all. Scott was just stoned. Same old Scott. "What's up, Burnout, my brother? I haven't seen you in like 15 years. How about a bro hug?" "Hey, how's it going, man? Look at you. What's your diet, man? Rabbit food and lettuce? You're not gonna get any ladies with that skinny body." "Your mom doesn't seem to mind." "Hey, Mark. I'm Danny. Do you remember me? Danny Bircher?" Scott's girlfriend gave me a shy smile and stuck out her hand so we could engage in a stiff handshake. "Yeah, I think so. You were in my sister's class, right? Charlotte Lantis?" Danny had the decency to look embarrassed. "Yeah, but we weren't really friends." That's putting it lightly, I thought. "We were freshmen when you guys were seniors," she added. "Yep, I do remember that. Maybe I should just get it over with." I called Charlotte over, and the reintroduction of the 2 girls, while awkward, was over pretty quickly, to everyone's relief. We were all eager to get into the park. It was odd not stopping at the window for tickets, and even odder to walk around the rusting turnstiles of the front gates. I delighted in reminding myself that we owned this place now. Brandon gave us a tour of the park. Not so much of the geography, we all knew that inside and out, but of his vision of the hypothetical layout and reorganization of Adventure Valley. The Excalibur is going to need the most work, according to Rich, our head contractor. A roller coaster made of wood exposed to the elements for all these years. We'll keep as much of the original structure as is safe, but we might have to rebuild most of it. Do we have the money for that? Scott asked loudly from where he walked behind us with Danny. Yeah, Tyler said. We have the money for that. Ah, Mr. Moneybags. That mini dealership treating you well? I nudged him hard with my shoulder. Tyler stumbled, but kept enough composure to push me back into a passing churro stall. Those 6 BMW dealerships are treating me very well. Well enough to serve as the sizable collateral we needed, Brandon added. So, Charlotte ran up behind us and threw her arms around Tyler and Koji. Can we ride some rides? Are you kidding? Why do you think we're here? Tyler laughed. I'm just here for Mayhem Mountain, I said, clapping my hands and rubbing them together eagerly. Brandon threw up his hands. All right, fine. I thought you guys would be interested in how your investment is coming along. Koji snorted. All we're interested in is the projected ROI, and more importantly, which rides have passed safety inspection. Oh. Brandon stopped walking and tried to look annoyed, and failing that, he smiled. A little over half of them are rideable. Suddenly, everybody was talking at once. Is Steel Viper on? Yeah, that one's on. What about Snapdragon? That one is good to go too. Renegade Falls? The water's not on. High Roller? Yes. Space Spin? Oh yeah. Power Tower? They're doing the inspection this week. There was only one ride I really cared about. Mine and Brandon's favorite. What about Mayhem Mountain? Hell yes, he answered, to collective groans from the rest. Mayhem Mountain had always been our thing. The others had always been happy to ride High Roller and Snapdragon into exhaustion. Brandon and I always split off toward the end of the day to ride Mayhem Mountain into the twilight hours. Ugh, Charlotte shuddered. I hate that ride. It's boring as hell, Koji agreed. I helped design something similar for Disneyland Hong Kong. It's so tame we put it in Fantasyland. Hey, that ride is awesome. It's long and it goes upside down, I argued. Charlotte is even too scared to ride it. I'm not scared of that ride, it just gives me the creeps. Something about it just seems, I don't know, off. Alright, look, we'll start at this end of the park and work our way toward the back. That way we can ride every ride that's passed inspection, including Mayhem Mountain, Brandon said. And Snapdragon, Tyler added, and the others nodded excitedly. Yes, every ride, and of course we can ride them, as many times as we want. Hell yes, brother. Koji high-fived Brandon and we headed down the street towards Space Spin. Our progress through the park was blissfully slow. Everyone wanted to ride every ride multiple times, and one person always had to stay in the loading area to operate the ride. It only took an hour or two to forget that I was a fully grown 35-year-old man. Being back here, running through the lineways with my friends, arguing who got the first row of the first car, it was like being 12 years old again. Still, my eye was constantly drawn up over the buildings into the distance, to the back of the park, where the high, gleaming rails of Mayhem Mountain shone in the unobscured sunlight. There would be no arguing who got front row on that coaster. It was me and Brandon. It was always me and Brandon. Charlotte, Tyler, and Koji were the most like children, constantly running ahead and arguing over which ride to go on next, yelling back to ask Brandon if this one or that one had been cleared by the contractors. Brandon and I hung back from the group a bit, discussing ideas and possible improvements for the park. Scott and Danny brought up the rear of the group, quietly talking and lighting joints. When we arrived at the Enterprise, a simple ride that consisted of spinning cars on a circular track, I offered to flip the switch while the rest of the group rode to XS. The Enterprise always made me sick when we were kids. Brandon offered to stay on the platform with me to chat, while everyone else rode the ride. I flipped the switch to turn the ride on, and as the car spun away from the loading area, the Enterprise's signage came into view. I sighed. All day I'd been trying to ignore the bright graffiti sprayed all over the park, but the words painted over the signage for the Enterprise were impossible to ignore. Where did the missing kids go? And the rest of the graffiti in the park was much the same. Most said things like, "Where are they?" "Runaway Row," "Find Ryan Kinski," and "The missing are now dead." Similar sayings could be found in towns sprayed across a few dilapidated buildings in the industrial district. Brandon's eyes avoided the sign, but I could tell he was thinking about it too. "Do you think the reason they shut this park down, do you see that being an issue for park attendants?" I asked as casually as I could. Brandon was quiet for a few moments as he waited for the ride to slow to a stop so he could flip the switch again. "Nah, I don't think so. Low attendance issues aren't really what shut this park down." "They aren't?" This surprised me. "No. When we were negotiating the sale of the park, I was given access to the park's financials in the 80s. "So they weren't operating at a loss?" "Oh, they were. But this park has operated in the red since opening day in the 70s. Half of their revenue was being fed back into something called county services, whatever that is. The bank couldn't tell me, and believe me, I tried to find out." "County services?" I mused. "Yeah, bizarre. And according to the paperwork, the park was closed because the owner didn't want to live here anymore, and he couldn't be bothered to wait for a decent offer on the property, so he just sold it to the bank for next to nothing. So he was a rich guy," I leaned back against the railing to stretch my back, "and an idiot." "Yes, to an extreme in both cases. The owner of the park was Abel Bisset." "Abel Bisset? Related to that French billionaire, I'm guessing?" Brandon nodded. "Michael Bisset. He built this park for his son in the 70s. Abel was never really what we would call business inclined. I've always heard him described as simple." "I can't believe the son of a billionaire lives in this area." "Well, not anymore. He moved on decades ago." I shook my head in disbelief. Who would have ever thought that our simple little park was owned by a famous billionaire's son? Hell, I might have even sat next to him on rides and never had any idea. "You guys want to go again?" Brandon yelled to the others as the ride came to a stop. "I'm ready to move on," Koji yelled back. "Anybody want to ride again?" "Nope," a chorus of voices replied. It was near 5 o'clock when we finally arrived at Mayhem Mountain. As the sun began to set, a familiar panic and urgency welled in the pit of my stomach. It took a moment for me to realize that we didn't have to leave when the park closed this time, because the park didn't close. We could stay until sunup if we wanted to. As I eagerly approached the turnstile for Mayhem Mountain, Tyler spoke up behind me. "Listen, can we run into town and grab something to eat before we ride Mayhem?" "You really want to ride Mayhem after we eat?" asked Koji. "Good point." "There's only one loop," Danny rolled her eyes. "Two," I said. "Don't forget the inline roll." "Yep, 2, Scott answered. "Plus it's a 2-minute ride. If your food isn't sitting well, you've got a long wait till it's over." "Look," I said, "let's ride it a couple of times and then go eat. When we come back, we'll see how we feel." Everyone nodded, and we started walking through the lineways up to the platform. When we reached the loading dock, I was excited to see our favorite green car sitting on the track. "Front seat!" Brandon and I yelled simultaneously as the train cars came into view and everyone behind us groaned. "I'm staying here," Charlotte said. "I'll just work the launch pad thingy." "Still scared after all these years, Char?" Scott teased her. "Shut up, burnout." Scott laughed and tousled her hair before running up and jumping in the first car behind Brandon and I. Danny got in next to him, and then Tyler and Koji took the second car. We pulled the shoulder restraints down, and they locked in place. "Ready?" Charlotte asked. "Yeah," Brandon yelled back. "Send the car through." Charlotte pulled the lever, and the brakes disengaged. As the car moved forward, I turned to Brandon. "Did we get the green car on purpose?" I yelled to him as the coaster clacked around the load platform and began the clattery climb up the first lift hill. "Yeah, we sent cars through here all morning, but I made sure Rich knew to leave the green machine in the loading bay." "Awesome!" As the train climbed up the lift hill, I made no attempt to hide my utter glee. I looked out over the expansive park and couldn't believe it was mine. Every track, every car, every turnstile, every screw. From the front gate to the overflow parking lot in the back, it was all ours. How I wished I could go back in time and tell young me waiting in the 2-hour line for Mayhem Mountain, "One day you will own this place." And as we crested the hill and the train fell into the first drop, I realized I essentially had gone back in time. At the very least, I was screaming like a 12-year-old, as was everyone else behind me. We dipped into the first tester hill and then banked up hard to the second lift hill. We dropped from there down into the vertical loop, banked around a set of gift shops, up briefly, and then down a small hill into the inline roll. When we arrived back at the loading bay, we were all screaming and whooping. Charlotte didn't even have to ask, just smiled at us and sent us through again. We went twice more before we finally got off the ride. Koji walked over to check out the control panel while the rest of us taunted my sister. "Are you sure you don't want to go, Char? It's awesome." "Nah, I'm good. I have no problem being the carny for this ride," she laughed. "Come on, Charlotte, just one time. One time and we'll leave you alone," Tyler urged. No way. Not interested. All right, anything else, though? "Hey, do you guys know what Track B is?" Koji asked. "Track B? What do you mean?" Brandon walked over to Koji at the control board and raised an eyebrow. "That's weird." "It's probably just the track they use to get the cars into the storage bay," Scott said with a shrug. "No," Koji said. "That's called a transfer track. Track B has to be something else." "Yeah, well, I've been on this ride enough times to know that there is no other track." "Yep," Tyler agreed. "He has." "So, should we try it?" Brandon tested. No," says Charlotte. "If you don't know what Track B is, that means the contractors don't know about it either, which means it hasn't been inspected in at least 20 years. That's suicide." "Look," Koji said, "if Track B exists, then even the most incompetent of engineers would have found it during an inspection. And Rich cleared this entire ride." Brandon nodded. "It's probably just the ride in reverse. We're good." "Well, we're in," announced Scott from the other side of the track, though Danny didn't look quite on board with the idea. "Mark?" Tyler asked. "Yeah, I guess I'm in. What's the worst that could happen? We get funneled into a repair bay?" "All right, then I'm in too," Tyler said hesitantly. Koji shrugged. "Here goes nothing." He flipped the switch over to Track B, and a moment later a loud metallic scraping sound some distance away filled the park. The sound lasted almost a minute. I studied the familiar silver roller coaster under the pink sky of the setting sun, but I saw no physical changes to the track. I looked over at Brandon and a shrug of his shoulders told me he didn't either. "Shall we?" Scott asked, gesturing to the train cars from which we'd just disembarked. I gave Charlotte a questioning look, but she emphatically shook her head no. So it was just the 6 of us again. "It's only right you two take the bow of the ship." Tyler gave a mock salute. "Oh, captains, my captains." I laughed and hopped into the right side of the front row. Brandon crawled into the seat next to me. Tyler and Koji got in behind us, and Scott and Danny took the back. We pulled the shoulder bars down, and they locked into place. "Are you sure about this?" Charlotte asked when everyone was settled. Danny said something from her place a few rows back, but all I heard was Brandon yelling, "Bullet!" The brakes released and the train rolled away from the platform and into the twilight of dusk. The lights had lit up on the track while we'd been arguing, and the roller coaster looked absolutely beautiful. I was filled with awe and reverence at what this place truly meant to me and my friends. It was a symbol of our youth and innocence and blissful ignorance of the problems and conflicts of the adult world. It was our own little bubble of happiness. The coaster again climbed the lift hill, and from the top, Brandon and I studied the track, but in those few seconds I saw no difference. Brandon looked over and I shook my head at him disappointedly. By the time we reached the vertical loop halfway through the ride, it was clear that there was no track B. But it was still hard to be upset because I was still on Mayhem Mountain and still found it an impossible challenge not to smile. We banked around the now brightly lit gift shops, up the small tester hill, and then back down the inline roll. Except the inline roll was suddenly above us. We'd missed it. Instead, the track now descended into a large square hole in the ground behind the gift shops, and we were headed directly into it. I was in too much shock to scream or even move. The black hole swallowed us in an instant, and we descended into complete darkness. I felt a comfortable pressure leave my shoulders and realized that the shoulder bars had released. I gripped the front lip of the edge of my seat and heard the terrified screams of my friends behind me as the coaster suddenly spun into what felt like an inline roll. I was too scared to do anything but hold on for dear life, though some part of my brain registered that the G-forces of the roll probably would have been enough to keep me in my seat, even if I had let go. Probably. We came out of the inline roll and dropped again hard. As the roller coaster dropped, the room suddenly lit up around us, and I saw the track below arcing up into a light tester hill. As we hit the bottom of the hill, the shoulder bars lowered mechanically. The car went over the small tester hill and then braked to start up another tall lift hill. I took my first breath since dropping through the ground and looked around, tuning out the screams of Danny and Tyler behind me. We were in what can best be described as a cavernous room, which I could only assume from its vastness stretched to the farthest reaches of the park above. There were lots of vertical loops, high drops, and sharp curves that put the track perpendicular to the ground. Throughout the entire sub-level building, lamps dotted the wall every 30 feet. They put out a dreary yellowed glow for as far as the eye could see, but many were burnt out, and in some places, the track disappeared into darkness. In the dull, yellow edges of the light, I saw something that registered in me a horror beyond death. Far away from us, in a section of shadowy track, I saw the high crest of a peak hill which reached almost to the ceiling of the giant room. And then the track just ended. Suddenly, I felt the horrible reality of the world outside my mind begin to bleed in. Danny was screaming uncontrollably, Tyler was crying, bawling even, and Koji was yelling at Brandon, who was looking straight at me, hitting my leg hard and repeating my name. As the cars continued to climb, I finally gave him my attention. I didn't want to be alone in the fear anymore. "What is this?" was all I could think of to say. "We have to get off this ride! We have to get off this ride, Mark!" "I know, man! We're going to die! I know, man!" I yelled as we reached the top of the lift hill and dropped over the other side. I squeezed my eyes shut until I felt the shoulder bars once again release, and I bit my lip to keep from crying. I opened my eyes and choked as I watched the track ahead of us bend up into a vertical loop. I reached up and tried to pull the shoulder bar down, but it was locked in place. "Hang on! Hang on to the seats!" I yelled as loud as I could. As we approached the loop, I felt the brakes engaging, slowing the car, and I felt a tow cable catch beneath my feet. We were being pulled up through the loop, but too slowly for gravity to keep us in our seats. As the train began to invert, I felt my feet rise from the floor of the car. My hair fell over my face and my butt left the seat. I closed my eyes and tried to block out the screams of terror from behind me. I concentrated on my death grip of the ledge of my seat as we rounded the track. We remained upside down for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the pressure began to ease, my butt dropped back into my seat, and my feet felt the floor. The white noise in my ears subsided, and I was suddenly aware of Koji screaming. "Tyler! Oh my god, he fell out! Oh my god, he fell! He's dead, man! He's dead! He hit the track down there!" Brandon yelled at me, wide-eyed and looking half-crazed. I was finally seeing the Brandon from my youth. The shoulder bars descended again, this time locking in tighter. We came out of the loop and sped up and down several tester hills. I tried to study the track ahead of us as we went through the safer parts. I thought I saw water reflecting off the metal rails somewhere in the distance. Brandon sobbed in his seat. "Mark, what are we gonna do? I don't want to die, man. I don't want to die. I don't know. I don't know what to do. I'm sorry, I'm scared too," I answered him. We banked around a corner of the room and the shoulder bars released again. This time, we dove into a curve that put the left side of the train parallel to the ground, and it was a long drop. I gripped the edge of the seat tightly as before, but this time I kept my eyes open and was able to catch Brandon as he began to slip out of his seat. By the time the train righted itself, I couldn't tell who'd been lost. Most of the screaming behind me had turned into loud sobbing or silence. The shoulder bar didn't re-engage, and I felt the car's brakes slow the train down again. I didn't have to look to know what was coming next. It was another inverted loop. This one was tall and large, and I could tell we'd be upside down for longer. Someone behind me began screaming again. Danny, I think, as I tried to take measured breaths and position my hurting hands back under the lip of the seat. Brandon did the same and looked over at me as the car started up the loop with tears streaming down his face. "I don't want to die in here, man." I shook my head back at him because I could think of nothing to say. I felt tears leave my own eyes as we reached the tipping point of the loop and my feet again left the floor. Before we were even completely upside down, I felt my back begin to slip down the seat. I thought, if I lost my grip, I could try to grab for the shoulder bars when I fell out of the car. The car suddenly stopped, and I opened my eyes to see we were completely inverted. I grunted loudly at the pain and immense effort it was taking to keep my grip on the seat. The car started to move again slowly, and I heard Brandon say something to me. I looked over at him, just before he slid out of the car. 1 second he was there beside me, and the next, he was falling away from the car. I saw Brandon try to grab the shoulder bar on the way out, but he couldn't keep his grip on it. I watched him fall, and I saw him break his back on the track below, and he stopped moving. I stared down at him as the car continued to move slowly around the loop, and he stared back up at me, dead or dying. By the time the car hit him on the way out of the loop, he was completely gone. The shoulder bars re-engaged, and we went through a dreadfully long period where nothing happened. We were secured in our seats by the restraints as the coaster spent what felt like several minutes racing over hills, banks, curves, even an inline roll. Without the adrenaline pumping through my veins, I felt the shock begin to wear off. It was replaced by a panic and fear unlike I'd ever experienced, and I decided that was the point of this section of track, to build and facilitate an unbearable fear. At long last, I felt the brakes engage, and I looked ahead to find the loop we were surely entering, but there was none. We were high, almost to the top of the ceiling, and we slowed to a stop on a straightaway. Directly ahead was a drop, and at the bottom of the hill, a series of 4 different tracks with a transfer stack just before they split off. Each track had 5 or so feet of color, red, orange, green, and blue, before racing off in different directions. I felt an urgent shaking of my shoulder and turned around to hear what Koji was saying. "Which track are we connected to?" I looked at the transfer stack. Green. Where does green go? It was hard to hear him over the sound of Danny's sobbing from the second car. I tried to trace the green track through the building, constantly losing it and finding it again. I wasn't sure, but it seemed to end at the lift hill I'd seen earlier. The hill with no track at the top. "It ends at that hill!" I yelled back at him and pointed. Danny cried louder. "Oh no." While we were stopped, I rubbed my hurting hands together. As I looked down at them, I noticed something new in the car. At some point, a small blinking panel had flipped over in the wall at the front of the car. It had 4 colored buttons and an old analog timer. The timer was so old and damaged that though the numbers were clearly changing, I couldn't see how long we had. "We get to choose," I said, and explained what I was looking at. "Can you see which track ends where?" Koji asked. I followed each of the tracks as best I could, but the rails circled and slid in between each other. It was hard to tell which track went where. "I think the blue track ends in that big pool in the corner. The red track ends in a wall, and the orange one just drops into a hole in the floor like the one we came down here through, I think." "There's no way out, dude," said Scott from the second car. His voice was unsettlingly calm. "They're just telling us how we're gonna die." "We can still find a way out of this," I answered quietly, speaking more to myself than to him. "Choose the pool," Scott said, and I could hear the tears in his voice. "I've heard drowning isn't an awful death. I've heard it's calming at the end." "No, choose the hole in the floor," said Koji. "It's possible it drops down into another cavern like this. There might be more track, which means more time to figure out how to live." "You don't think we'd be the first to choose that option, do you?" Scott asked him. "And no one that went missing ever came back. There's just more death in that hole." "I don't want to die like this," Koji begged. "And at least it's a chance." Danny was still whimpering in the back and offered no suggestion. It seemed the decision was up to me, and I had to make it fast. I knew I didn't want to die by dropping off the track. I didn't want to drown. Perhaps the quickest death was the wall. More than likely, we would all be killed instantly. Less suffering. Less time to think about our fates. But the truth was, I wasn't entirely positive which track ended where. It was all educated guesswork, and my time was up. "The orange! Let's go down to the second floor, if there is one." Scott and Danny said nothing, and Koji choked out the last words I'd ever hear him say. "Push it, before it chooses for us." Before I could think about it any longer, I pushed the orange button and committed us to whatever death it promised. We heard the metallic scraping of the track transferring below. Once the orange track was securely connected, the brakes on the car released and the train rolled slowly toward the drop. Danny started screaming again. As we dropped down the hill, I got a better view of the orange track. There was a vertical loop ahead that didn't look as high as the others we'd been through. In fact, it looked like there was a chance the fall wouldn't kill us, if it wasn't an optical illusion, and if the shoulder bars disengaged for that loop, we might have a shot at living through this. I yelled back to everyone behind me. "Let yourself fall out of the loop! The one up there!" No one responded to me, which didn't matter because I didn't think I'd have the courage to let go of the seat anyway. We raced along the track, in and out of banks and curves, and at one point we passed along the pool and I looked down. Below the water's surface, the track ended above an even deeper pool. I could see the shadows of several coaster cars at the very bottom. I suddenly felt the brakes engage, and I realized we were coming to the loop. I tested the shoulder bar by pushing up on it, but it stayed locked. I was momentarily relieved to think I wouldn't have to make the decision to fall out now or gamble on the orange track. But suddenly, the restraints released. As we started up the loop, I gripped the lip of the seat tightly and turned my head back to look down. It looked like we were very high, and I only hoped the ground was the loosely packed dirt that it looked like. I had to choose right then, the fall or the hole. I chose the fall. As I began to slide up the seat, I yelled at the others to let go and fall out of the car, and then I closed my eyes and let go. I felt my head crack the shoulder bar on the way out. It wasn't like a slow motion fall. It was over before I realized that I'd actually let go. One moment, I felt an intense pain as my head hit the bar, and in the same moment, I realized I was on the ground. I hadn't even had the time to realize the possibility of hitting the track below or getting run over by the cars. I opened my eyes in time to watch the cars speed over the track above me. The pain didn't hit me all at once. I had one long, blissful second before I felt it. And then I was in agony. I'd hoped my body would be so in shock that I wouldn't feel much of the pain, but I felt it all. I concentrated on keeping my eyes open and trying to catalog the damage. There was blood on my clothes, but I didn't know from what part of my body it was coming. I heard screaming as well, but I didn't know if it was in my own head or coming from my friends as they approached the gruesome end. I didn't want to move, didn't think it was safe to move, but I knew I had to, if only to pull out my phone. With trembling fingers, I pulled the thing from my pocket and brought it to my face, trying to focus on the screen, but it was shattered and refused to even turn on. I threw it away from me, and suddenly, I became aware of the oppressive silence. Their ride had ended. With Herculean effort, I rolled over onto my stomach and dragged my broken body across the ground to where I thought I remembered seeing the hole. I crawled for what seemed like hours, and maybe it was. Sometimes I tried to stand or even kneel, but the pain in my back and ribs was too great. I passed out several times from shock and pain, but eventually I made it to where the track disappeared into the ground. I pulled myself to the edge and looked down inside the hole. The track ended just below the surface. It was a natural shaft with walls made of rock. I don't know how deep it went, and I didn't want to. It was a fate I'd only narrowly escaped. But then I thought of my friends down there, and ever so fleetingly wondered if maybe someone had survived. Koji? My voice echoed loudly down the shaft. No answer. Scott! Nothing. I reached for a nearby screw and dropped it down the hole. It took far too long to land, and when it did, it was with a tink as it hit something metallic. The small sound echoed up the shaft and out into the cavernous room, and I realized this place was built with acoustics in mind. I rolled onto my back and studied everything I could see from where I was, staving off my body's desire to pass out again. I felt nothing but numbness when I finally saw what I was looking for. A long, panoramic window in the far wall. I knew then what track B was for, and I finally let myself slip away into the darkness. I remember very little of my rescue. There were lots of people in uniform and my sister yelling and pain. Lots of pain. I was in and out on the way to the hospital, but I remember I passed through the room behind the window at some point, and from my stretcher, through the chaos, I saw in that room a single chair facing the window. It was covered in a deep layer of dust. I was never visited by anyone official, let alone asked to give a statement. Charlotte stayed by my bedside at the hospital for months while I recovered. She wouldn't say much about that day, although she finally did tell me something. She said that they wouldn't let her ride with me to the hospital, and that someone had offered her a lift. On that drive, she'd been confronted by two people that had convinced her to never speak of what had happened, and had instructed her to convince me of the same. Whatever they threatened her with had her begging me to agree. And I did. At the time. I am still, to this day, relearning to walk without aid. I never saw Mayhem Mountain again. The loan defaulted, and Adventure Alley was bought up by an unknown LLC, which bulldozed it to the ground and built a block of apartments over the top. They're still empty to this day. I don't like the dark anymore. It reminds me of the horror my friends must have experienced as they looked down and saw the track end just before they disappeared into that hole. I try not to think of what they must have felt as they plummeted down the shaft in complete darkness, strapped to a roller coaster, awaiting the terrible end. I wish I'd chosen the pool, if only to save them from that fate. As for the billionaire's son, he was only simple in the fact that he was a man of simple tastes. And he still is. I looked him up once, only a few years ago. He owns several amusement parks now, all sizable, but small enough to be popular only in their specific regions. In fact, one is not very far from where I live now. But then I realized that I probably didn't need to search all the rides in the park to confirm what I already know. Somewhere in that park, some ride, in some corner, has a track B.
Part 1. It began when Tommy G decided we were going to emulate a Wiccan ritual he found in one of those old books from his attic. We were kids. Suzanne, Reggie, Tommy G. Franco, and I. Reggie and Franco were the oldest at 14, while the rest of us were all still a year younger. This adventure was the product of a string of snow days after a blizzard. Without school to keep us busy for 7 hours a day, our parents bundled us up and turned us loose on the winter world. There was a small tract of woods less than a mile from my house with a clearing you could get to if you knew where to find it. We agreed to meet there, each of us bringing a component of the ritual squirreled away somewhere in the multiple layers of our fleece and downy jackets. Suzanne brought a few candles, Reggie got his hands on a knife from his dad's workshop. I brought a can of red spray paint and Franco brought a lighter. Tommy G, the ringleader, brought the sacrifice, his pet snake, Sissy. We gathered in the clearing later that afternoon and Tommy G laid out the plan. We spray painted a 10-foot pentagram in the snow at the center of which sat an old stump. Suzanne put her candles around the base of the stump and Reggie struggled against the wind to keep them lit. At Tommy G's instructions, we all stood at the 5 points at the edge of the pentagram while he recited what he called a holy incantation. The ritual was supposed to let us see people's guardian spirits. As the biblical symbol of evil, the snake would allow us to see the otherwise invisible divines around us through its sacrifice. I can't tell you how cold that clearing felt. Sure, it was February, on the tail end of a cold snap that buried our little Midwestern town in 2 feet of snow, but the chill I felt started from the inside and gnawed its way out. I was sweating under all those layers, but my stomach felt like a block of ice. The wind whipped through the leafless trees and blew out one of the candles as Tommy G was finishing the last of the incantation. Maybe that's what went wrong, or maybe it was all a fuck-up from the start. Either way, the 5 of us marched in unison from the edges of the pentagram to the stump at the center. Tommy G pulled an Aldi's bag from somewhere out of the depths of his coat and sat it atop the stump. I could see the agitated snake writhing inside its plastic sack prison. Reggie handed over the knife and Tommy G cut Sissy free and laid her atop the frozen stump. We must have stood in silence for a solid minute, just stealing nervous glances at one another. Tommy G pinned Sissy's head to the stump. Sissy wriggled uncomfortably against the freezing wood. Finally, Reggie said that Tommy G wouldn't do it, and Tommy G responded by taking action. He pressed the knife's edge down behind Sissy's skull and smashed the blade down like he were chopping a carrot. Suzanne yelped. Sissy's decapitated body twisted and rolled itself into knots before falling limp into the snow. A stream of blood leaked down the side of the stump and stained the snow bright red. No one said anything for a while. Then Franco muttered, "Fuck," and went to dry heave in the woods. Suzanne sat down and began to cry. Reggie, Tommy G, and I just stood motionless around the stump, staring down at Sissy's head. Is that all?" I asked. "Yeah," Tommy G said hollowly. "That's all." No one mentioned that we weren't seeing any spirits. We fled out of the pentagram and crowded together at the edge of the clearing. That ice block in my stomach had expanded into a certified glacier, and I felt like I would vomit any moment. Reggie took his father's knife back and frantically tried to rub away the blood with snow. I guess after a while, the awkward silence became too much for Franco because he wadded up a snowball in his gloves and chucked it at Reggie's back. That seemed to break the spell because in no time we were all dashing around the edge of the trees, pelting each other with snowballs and ducking away from incoming fire. Eventually, we began to laugh again and pushed the memory of the ritual out of our minds. Kids can do that somehow. A heavy snow started just as the sun was going down. We had wanted to build a snowman but didn't have the time, so we decided we'd all make snow angels in the clearing instead. We spread out in a row so that our angels would line up like chorus dancers. Tommy G lay down, then Franco, and Reggie, then Suzanne, and me at the end. We pushed the imprint of our bundled up bodies into the snow and waved our arms and legs. Just as I was finishing up mine, a surge of fear and coldness rushed through me, made me convulse where I lay. I turned my head to say something, and woven behind the sheet of falling snow that blasted down around us, I saw the faintest outline of a human-like figure glide behind Tommy G. It was there, and then it was gone. It was nothing really, but it was definitely something. A blur in the background, a slight smudge of the world hushing by just behind Tommy G. Tommy G saw me staring and asked what my deal was. I announced that I might have seen a guardian spirit. Reggie and Franco booed and jeered. None of them wanted to bring up the botched ritual. Tommy G looked like a kicked puppy because he had just remembered that he had killed his only pet. Tears were welling up in Suzanne's eyes again. I told him I was just joking. I didn't mean any harm. Nighttime was creeping over the world, so we all packed up and hiked back home. That was on Friday. The weekend passed by, and none of the 5 of us saw each other. I woke up on Monday morning feeling surprisingly refreshed. The sun was just rising outside my window. I was nestled into the warmth of my comforter with the gentle drone of the heat moaning in the vents. It was 8:30 in the morning, and my mom had let me sleep in due to a 2-hour delay. When the school bus picked me up, all of my classmates were chatting and running amok. 5 days with no school had filled us with rambunctiousness that could not be contained. We joked and laughed and took turns talking about how we wished another blizzard would come and bury the whole school in snow. The bus was so busy and chaotic that none of us even noticed Tommy G wasn't there. In fact, I didn't notice myself until 3rd period when I sat at an empty table in English class. Tommy G sat behind me, and we'd usually spend the whole hour passing notes and dirty doodles back and forth. At lunch, I asked Franco and Reggie if they'd seen Tommy G, but no one had. He must have been homesick, the lucky bastard. The day dragged by, but eventually we all got dropped off on the corner, and Reggie, Franco, Suzanne, and I stood on the sidewalk shivering. We decided we would head over to Tommy G's place to give him a hard time about playing hooky. When we got to his house, the driveway and curb were both packed with cars. We figured his parents were having a party. but we'd stop by if only for a minute. Standing on the slick porch, we rang the doorbell and waited. After a few minutes, an older man we didn't recognize answered and asked what we wanted. His eyes were puffy behind his glasses. We told him we had come by to see Tommy G, and he ushered us into the foyer without a word. Inside, the mood was beyond solemn. People we didn't recognize were milling about and talking in whispers. "What's going on?" Reggie asked. "Well," the man said, then paused to consider his words. He removed his glasses and wiped at his eyes. "I don't know if I'm the one that should be telling you this." "Telling us what?" I asked. The man stared at us for a few seconds, then seemed to accept the burden of delivering bad news. He said, "Tommy's family was in a bad car wreck." He cast his eyes into the living room where all of the sad people were roaming about. I'm afraid to say, well," he cleared his throat. "I'm sorry to have to say that, Tommy didn't survive." The four of us kids just stood there dumbfounded. We were waiting for something to tell us this was just a cruel joke. We hung in that surreal moment like flies encased in ice cubes. Suzanne's face scrunched up into an awful grimace. "Tommy and his family were killed," the man said. "How?" Franco mumbled. "Tommy had a bad head injury," the man said. I stared into the living room at all the people glancing over at us. Just around the corner, I heard someone say, "brain hemorrhaging," under their breath. And the person they whispered it to gasped into their hand. How can I put into words how empty we all felt walking down that driveway? We took turns looking at each other with blank faces, and then tears began to stream down Suzanne's cheeks. My eyes swelled up as well, and I turned my head to wipe the tears away before they froze in the wind. None of us said a word. None of us could think of anything to say. We just split up and trudged home over the icy sidewalks. When I got to my house, I stopped and turned to gaze into the woods down the street. I couldn't stand going into my house. I knew my parents would see the pained look on my face and start asking questions. If I told them about Tommy G, I would absolutely break down. So before I had to face that, I wanted to return to the clearing. I wanted to stand in the place where I had last spoken to Tommy G, where we had thrown snowballs at each other and laughed and trounced around in the snow. The woods were dead silent. That harsh winter wind tore through the branches and whipped my cheeks beet red. I found Sissy's headless body at the edge of the clearing where Tommy G had thrown it before going home. A light dusting of snow covered its black scales. It was frozen solid. The spray-painted pentagram had faded also, and the candles were toppled over in the drift. On the opposite side of the clearing, our 5 snow angels remained, but I noticed something strange from a distance. I approached them slowly because in my mind I already knew what I had seen. As I stood over the 5 snow angels, I began to tremble uncontrollably because there, where Tommy G's head had laid, the snow was stained bright red. Part 2. Reggie took Tommy G's death the hardest. The two had been inseparable. Reggie grew up poor and in a pretty rough household, so Tommy G's place was where Reggie went to escape when his parents argued and screamed. He wasn't at school the next few days, and we understand why. That Friday night, we all met up again. Reggie, Franco, Suzanne, and me. Franco had a little clubhouse in his backyard that his father had built for him and his brothers. It was still so cold that we sat for a while in silence, watching our breath hang in the air. I wanted to tell everyone about what I had seen in the clearing. I wanted to say the words brain hemorrhaging like I had overheard at Tommy G's wake, and then show them the red snow that stained the head of Tommy G's snow angel. But I thought it was stupid. The red color might have come from anywhere. Maybe it had gotten on the hood of Tommy G's coat after he decapitated the snake, and I just hadn't noticed it when we first made the snow angels. I don't remember what we even talked about. We were preteens that had just lost a close friend. How could our young minds express what we were feeling? But I do remember when the night ended. Reggie was headed back to his apartment, the opposite direction as me and Suzanne. Maybe that's why Suzanne decided to tell me, because it was the first convenience of being alone with one of us.
I saw something,
Susan said out of nowhere. What do you mean? I asked. There was about a half a mile of sidewalk between us and our houses. We would have to pass the forest on the way.
In the clubhouse, I saw...
She was staring down at her feet as she spoke. She clamped her arms tight to her sides and drove her hands deep into her pockets.
Something is all.
Well, what was it? I asked.
What do you think of the ritual we did, Andrew?
She asked. The image of the blood-stained snow angel's head flashed in my mind. I didn't say anything. She asked,
Do you think it worked?
I remembered then what I had seen in the clearing that Friday, the blur of movement that whisked by behind Tommy G through the wind-driven snow. I wished desperately that that memory was more vivid. Even at the time, I couldn't say I really saw a person. It was just a hollowness in the air. Yet somehow, I recognized it as a being, something that moved with purpose. When I didn't answer, she asked again.
Did the ritual work?
Have you seen any spirits? I spat, sharply. I didn't want to tell her what I knew. Suzanne was touchy and prone to crying. I wasn't going to be the person that set her off.
Maybe, she said. I don't know.
I stopped walking and stared at her. After a few steps, she turned and met my eyes. I asked, What do you mean, maybe?
Back in the clubhouse, I think I saw something, she said.
What did you see? I asked. She shrank back a bit because I had become suddenly animated. I think between us we knew there was something not right going on.
It was nothing, she whined,
but there were tears starting to form in her eyes, and I knew she wanted to say something. I whispered, Suzanne.
It was just like a shadow. Well, no, not a shadow. It wasn't dark. It was clear, she said.
Where? I pried.
Just as we were leaving the clubhouse. You and I were still inside, and Franco was heading up to his porch, and I saw Reggie going around the side of the house. And it just flew right past him.
Like steam? Or like a piece of glass? I asked. She was beginning to tremble because she could see that I was nervous.
Yeah, like steam. It was just...
She sawed the sleeve of her jacket across her running nose.
She was hollow.
She? I asked. A knot had worked its way up my throat.
Yeah, it's stupid. I felt like it was a woman,
Suzanne said. I went back to the clearing after we found out Tommy G died, I said.
Yeah, so?
She said. I saw something there, I said. I turned and looked off toward the woods. The sun was beginning to set, and it was too late for us to venture off into the clearing and back before it grew dark. I must have been staring too long without saying anything because Suzanne stomped her foot on the icy pavement to get my attention.
Tell me,
she demanded. I don't want to tell you. I think I should show you, I said.
Then show me.
It's too late tonight. We can go tomorrow. Meet at my house and I'll take you out to the clearing.
Should we tell Reggie and Franco?
She asked. They'll think we're nuts, and I don't think we should be bringing up Tommy G around Reggie right now, I said. Just you and I. We met early that Saturday morning, and it had snowed a little overnight, and I was afraid the snow angels would be buried. Suzanne dressed light for the weather in a powder blue sweater and tight jeans. Her brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she had a blue headband that covered her ears and most of her forehead. It dawned on me for the first time that Suzanne was cute. She was the sporty type, not quite a tomboy, but not exactly a girly girl either. I wondered why I had never noticed the faint freckles that spanned the bridge of her nose. The forest was silent as we hiked towards the clearing. The trip took about 10 minutes maximum, but I recall that I never heard a single bird or squirrel the whole way there. I heard our heavy breathing, with the vapors of our exhalations billowing up into the dead branches. Now and then some snow would crash down on the ground, somewhere in the distance. But all in all, this little tract of woods seemed lifeless. Surprisingly, the clearing looked like it hadn't gotten even a dusting of snow. Sissy's headless body still lay frozen on the edge of the clearing. The blood that ran down the sides of the old stump had darkened to a sick brown hue, and the spray paint of the pentagram was still visible on the snow. I grabbed Suzanne's wrist and led her across the clearing. There laid our 5 snow angels all in a row. Tommy G's, then Reggie's, then Franco's, and Suzanne's, and my own at the end. "What is that?" Suzanne squealed. I had led her to Tommy G's snow angel, and she was staring down where Tommy G's head had laid, and it was still dyed bright red. I think... My breath shivered out between my chapped lips, and I glanced over at Suzanne's face. "I think it's blood." "Oh no," she moaned. She covered her face with her black gloved hands. "No, no, no." She took a step away from the snow angel with each utterance of the word. "Where did it come from? Whose blood?" "I don't know," I said. "I came here right after we left Tommy G's house on Monday, and it was here." I didn't tell anyone because I didn't bother finishing my sentence. "Do you think it has anything to do with..." Neither did she. We both turned towards the old stump and Sissy's severed head. "That's what I wanted to tell you, about the things you saw yesterday," I said. I sat down in the snow and pulled my legs up against my chest. "I saw it too." "You saw it?" "Yes, well, no," I said. "I saw one here, in the clearing. When we were making these, I jerked my head towards the 5 snow angels. It was snowing really hard, and windy, and something just floated by." Suzanne and I were staring into each other's eyes. It was a serious stare, the depths of which were just sussing out between us, behind Tommy G. We both mulled it over in our heads for a few minutes. Then Suzanne walked back to Tommy G's snow angel and stared down at the red stain again. Then she began to cry, and she was trying to keep it quiet. So I pretended I didn't notice. An immense emptiness flooded my insides. It was helplessness. I felt like a balloon whose air had all been squeezed out of him by the pressing cold, and I was left sagging there atop the snow, waiting to fully deflate and be buried by the next blizzard. "What the hell is this?" Suzanne asked. It snapped me out of my trance, and I looked over. She had moved from Tommy G's snow angel and was staring down into Reggie's. I stood up and trudged my way over to her side. I couldn't figure out what I was seeing either. "It's..." Suzanne got down on one knee and pressed her fingers into Reggie's snow angel. "It's ice." She was right. A solid sheet of ice had formed inside Reggie's angel, as if someone had filled the imprint halfway with water and let it freeze overnight. We looked to our left and right. Franco, Suzanne, and my angels were untouched, and Tommy G's still had that wicked red stain on its head. What do you think it is?" Suzanne asked. "I think we better leave," I said. The return trip through the woods was just as eerily silent as the first had been. Now and then, one of us would snap a twig hidden somewhere under the snow, but even the wind was mute as we trekked towards home. Neither of us could think of anything to say. When we got back, Franco was waiting for us on my porch. He was staring at the ground. When he heard us coming, he looked up with an expression that read nothing but pain. "It's Reggie," he said. Here's the account of Reggie's death the way I heard it. His parents were out drinking that Friday night and left him home with his 2 cousins. His cousins were 17 and 16. The winter had given them all cabin fever, and so they decided to roam around Reggie's complex. There's a big man-made lake out behind Reggie's apartment, and it had been frozen over for weeks. They were a band of reckless kids and decided to see if they could walk out to the middle of it. The oldest cousin was up front. then the younger one, and Reggie trailed along a few yards behind. Reggie's cousins are big. Not just tall, but heavy too. They must have both had 100 pounds on Reggie. But it wasn't the largest one who was leading the column towards the center of the lake. It wasn't the younger one who was shuffling along a couple steps behind. It was Reggie, the young one, the skinny one, whose weight broke through the icy surface of the water. His cousins say they heard the loud snap of the shattering surface, but by the time they turned around, Reggie had vanished. Where he stood was a jagged hole clogged with chunks of ice. There wasn't any thrashing or screams for help. Reggie was there, then he was gone. They swept the snow away with their gloves to see if they could spot him struggling down below, but there was nothing in the murky black. The oldest cousin thrust his arm down into the hole, up to the shoulder, and fished all around, but there was nothing to pull up. The police brought in a diving team, and they plunged down into the hole one after another. When they pulled Reggie up a half an hour later, the skin was completely blue, and his arms were frozen stiff around his chest. Part 3. Franco was sick to his stomach when Suzanne and I told him about the snow angels, about the brief apparitions that both of us had seen just before Tommy G and Reggie died. He traversed the whole spectrum of emotions, anger that we had kept it secret, unabashed sobbing when the guilt of his taking part in the ritual surfaced, and then terror that his own snow angel laid right next to Reggie's. At that revelation, something in him broke, and he began to laugh. We thought he was crying again at first, but then he tossed back his head and guffawed, and slapped his knee and sighed in a relieved way. Franco didn't have a death wish. Something had gone wrong in his head, and we should have been more proactive because Suzanne and I both knew it. Franco was the kind of kid that always had things go his way. His parents spoiled the hell out of him. He was handsome and charming and was graced with beautiful blue eyes. He was a teenage heartthrob just a few years short of blooming, and now, suddenly, he was just the next in line. Some time passed, a couple weeks. We were in the first days of March, and while it hadn't snowed much, freezing temperatures kept the grounds covered. We hadn't been back to the clearing since Reggie fell through the ice. I couldn't stomach to see the red stain on the head of Tommy G's snow angel or the 2-inch sheet of ice pooled up in Reggie's. What none of us said, though, was the real reason we were avoiding the clearing. No one wanted to see if there was something on Franco's. We just ignored it. The three of us tried to go through the motions at school, but even school had become a grim place. 2 students died in the blink of an eye. The teachers carried on as if everything was normal, but their heart wasn't in it. The students still chatted and joked, and passed notes, but even our laughter was the guilty, hollow kind. Everyone treated Franco, Suzanne, and I different. We could do no wrong. There were offers of assistance for every mundane task we came across. I caught people's glances in the cafeteria when the 3 of us sat together. None of us eating much, none of us talking much. Franco was especially quiet. He just sat doodling most of the time, and none of the teachers said anything about it. He didn't turn in homework. He half-heartedly scribbled answers on exams. Franco was a different person. There was Franco in the hallway with mismatching shoes. There was Franco in the cafeteria flooding his lunch tray with ranch because he forgot to let off the pump. There was Franco sitting in his front yard, jamming a stick into the mud. I felt bad for him. One day I pulled Suzanne aside and told her we had to do something. Sure, we were still pretty messed up about Tommy G and Reggie too, but Franco was facing something we couldn't understand. Maybe we were just making assumptions about the nature of this ritual we botched, but empirical evidence suggested that our punishment was moving in a definite order, and in that order, Franco's death was the next stepping stone. We showed up to his house with a cake. Yes, this was the best that our preteen brainstorming could come up with. Surely, we thought, some fucking sweets would turn things around. His parents ushered us into the house, smiling hard because they worried about what their son had become and were glad to have help from his friends. We found Franco in his room, just sitting there. No music turned on, no magazine in front of him. He conducted himself as if he were in death's waiting room. We circled around him, then joined him on the floor, setting the cake in front of him. Franco just sort of nodded, then returned his gaze to the wall. Franco's parents had given us some paper plates and some plastic forks, and Suzanne held the knife out to Franco and asked if he wanted to cut the cake, and at the sight of it, Franco lunged like a cat against the wall. He tripped over half of his belongings, scrambling around the room. I shot my hand out to Suzanne and pushed the knife down to the carpet. Franco was nearly hyperventilating. We just stared. It was quiet like that for a minute or two. Then all three of us laughed. And we laughed hard. Franco got the best chuckle of us all and cracked jokes at his own expense, pretending to claw his way up the wall, making hissing sounds. It seemed like everything was back to normal. But then Franco started talking about some weird thing lemurs did that he read about in National Geographic, and he stopped mid-sentence because Suzanne was staring at him with her eyes as wide as headlights and her lower lip quivering, and I looked up where she was looking and saw it. Something between a cloud of vapors and a woman was kneeling behind Franco. There was no face to make out or clothes that I can describe. It was just as if a human had been painted in those squiggly lines you see in the air above hot pavement on a summer day. Franco was asking us what our deal was when the spirit unfurled a pair of wings the width of a truck from behind her back and hugged her ethereal arms around Franco's shoulders. Franco said we were giving him goosebumps all of a sudden. "Franco," Suzanne whimpered, "it's here." Guardian angels are a legend that says when people are in trouble, divine spirits will intervene on their behalf. It was supposed to be a sign that a person's time hadn't yet come. The ritual with the snake and the pentagram and the candles and the incantations, that was supposed to let us see guardian angels. But we were seeing them all wrong. The spirits, these wisps, these mirages, they weren't guarding anybody. They were announcing death. No, worse yet, they were setting death in motion. Would Tommy G have been in that car crash if there was no ritual? Would Reggie have fallen through the ice if no one had lopped off Sissy's head? If we weren't such gullible and reckless children, would Suzanne and I have seen Franco innocently shivering in this evil spirit's embrace? Franco was in bad shape. He was shaking like a leaf in a tree. He was pale. He was fighting back tears, and he kicked the cake across his room, and he took the knife we were using to cut the cake, and he threw it out the window. Franco marched into the bathroom down the hall. From behind the locked door, he gave us instructions. We had to go to the clearing and see what had become of his snow angel. He was just too scared to join us. It was safer if he just locked himself up in the bathroom and did nothing. Not a single thing. He was sobbing so hard, we could barely make out the words. Now and then, he would lash out with screaming and cursing and beat his fists against the counters. Suzanne and I left in a hurry, not bothering to tell his parents what was going on. Franco's house was the furthest of all of us from the clearing. I grabbed Suzanne by the elbow, and the two of us jogged our way towards the woods. Twice, Suzanne collapsed mid-step and sat shivering on the pavement. I wiped the tears from her eyes. I told her we didn't have time to cry yet. It took us 15 minutes to get to the entrance of the woods. It took another 10 to find the clearing. And when we did, there lay Franco's snow angel, the third in line. And it was a sickening sight. A pile of brackish green bile was freezing in the center of the snow angel. Neither of us could tell what this ugly goop was, but it gave off a putrid chemical smell, and there were little powdery chunks of something mixed in it. I got a stick and churned up the slimy puddle. It was stringy and sticky like mucus. When I disturbed it, the god-awful smell became overpowering. Suzanne and I had to walk away and collapse in the snow to catch our breath. "What is it?" Suzanne pleaded. "What does it mean?" "I don't know," I yelled. I was furious. "Is Franco going to die?" Suzanne asked, her voice crackling. I beat my fists into the snow and began to rock back and forth on my knees. A headache pounded inside my skull. "I don't know," I said. I grit my teeth and scrunched up my face and groaned, as if terror were a physical wound stinging in my chest. "I don't know." What Suzanne and I did know was that we really didn't know anything. In the realest sense of the cliché, We were messing with forces we did not understand. What good did it do for the two of us to come to the clearing? What good would it do to know that Franco's death was imminent when we didn't know how or why or when it was coming? We must have sat there in the clearing for 20 minutes, each of us just silent with our thoughts. After a while, I pulled Suzanne up to her feet. "We've got to go tell him," I said.
"Would you want to be told?"
Suzanne asked. "I don't know." We didn't get a chance either way. By the time we got back to the house, Franco was being loaded into the back of an ambulance. His dad hugged his arms around Franco's wailing mother. She looked up at us with tears running all over her red face, but didn't say anything before they climbed into the ambulance with their son. Turns out, Franco couldn't handle the potential of his own death, and he took matters into his own hands. He was locked up in the bathroom, and shortly after we left for the clearing, Franco just started swallowing down whatever cleaners and solvents and pills he could find in the cabinets. His dad kicked down the door when Franco didn't respond and found him on the floor surrounded in empty bottles of Drano and sleeping pills and toilet bowl cleaner. At the hospital, they pumped his stomach, but it didn't help. He was in a coma for a couple of hours, and then all his organs failed in a hurry. Just like Tommy G and Reggie, he was there 1 minute, and then he was gone. Suzanne broke down and told her parents everything. Then all hell broke loose in our little town. The local papers printed headlines about 5 teenagers performing black magic and sacrifice in the woods. The nightly news instructed parents on how to spot signs of Satan worship. I was ostracized at school when I eventually returned to classes. No one sat with me at lunch or spoke to me in the halls. The teachers regarded me like an ugly stain in their classrooms. Suzanne was pulled out of school and sent to live with her grandparents in New England. I never got a chance to say goodbye to her between Franco's death and her departure. I watched from my bedroom window as her family's SUV, packed to the brim with luggage, pulled out of the driveway and sped off to the airport. I was grounded indefinitely, but that was fine, because I had nowhere to go. My friends were all dead. No one in town would acknowledge me. On grocery trips, I would follow at my parents' heels, trying to ignore all the people staring at me from down the aisles. I heard that Suzanne was in therapy, and I was glad, because that meant she was alive and the spirit hadn't checked off the next name on its list. My parents eschewed the need for a psychiatrist and took me straight to a priest instead. He pried for details of the ritual and everything that happened after. He prayed with me for hours. It was funny to me because even after explaining what happened to Tommy G and Reggie and Franco, no one actually believed it was black magic or spirits that had brought about their death. Tommy G and Reggie were victims of accidents, they said, and Franco had killed himself because he was frightened and depressed and didn't know better. Strange that no one actually believed in the ritual's power, but I was still punished as if it were our fault. It was early April by the time I was finally able to leave the house on my own again. Even then, I had to check in with my parents every half hour and provide a detailed itinerary of everything I was up to. Spring was just around the corner, and the snow was melting everywhere that received steady sunlight. I got an email from Suzanne late one night. She was coming home to visit her parents for the weekend. She wasn't allowed to see me, but she wanted to sneak out anyway so that we could talk. She said she was doing well and that therapy was helping her cope. She hadn't seen any more spirits. She had spent those first weeks after Franco's passing terrified that her own death was hiding in every shadow, but when it didn't come, her fear began to fade. She seemed optimistic in her email. That made me feel better too. She asked me to go to the clearing again and see if our snow angels had melted. If they were gone, she wrote, then she could finally feel safe. I didn't tell my parents about the email, but Suzanne's parents must have tipped them off because they kept a tight leash on me all that week. Once again, I was confined to the house, and my desire to return to that clearing one last time burned like a raging fire in my gut. Finally, the day of Suzanne's flight, I managed to persuade my parents to let me walk to the dollar store. I told them I had a project for school and needed to grab a few craft supplies. I would go straight there and hurry back, I promised, and they agreed. The neighborhood was wet and bleak with only a few piles of dirty snow still lining the streets. As soon as I was out of sight of my house, I headed for the woods. Buds were forming in the branches and the sound of birds and barking squirrels had returned. The ground was black with mud as I walked among the trees. Now and then I stopped to look towards the sky, where, somewhere inside those billowing gray clouds, Suzanne was barreling across the world on a commercial airliner. I smiled. Seeing Suzanne after so long would give me the first inkling of closure that I needed. I was sure of it. In the clearing, the shade of the trees had preserved a patchy blanket of snow. The pentagram had melted away. Sissy's dried-up brown blood had faded into the stump. A long tract of snow remained where our snow angels had been made on that terrible Friday, but the snow angels themselves had melted away, and I could only make out a rough outline of them composed of mud and standing water. I stood at the foot of Suzanne's snow angel and stared up at the sky in hopes that I would catch a glimpse of her plane flying by, and I took a deep breath before kneeling down to check the snow angel for any blemishes. There was no blood, no bile, no ice, nothing. I let out a sigh of relief. I closed my eyes tight and smiled. It was over. I opened my eyes. Then, thump. Like a hammer from the sky, a blackbird plummeted out of thin air and slammed into the ground, right where Suzanne's snow angel had laid.
Chilling tales for dark nights.